ask Madinah to come up and open up this meeting.
Thank you so much to the Muslim Institute for your warm invitation. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ومن آياته خلق السماوات والأرض وما بث فيهما من دابة وهو على جمعهم إذا يشاء قدير. وما أصابكم من مصيبة فبما كسبت أيديكم ويعفو عن كثير. وما أنتم بمعجزين في الأرض وما لكم من دون الله من ولي ولا نصير. ومن آياته الجوار في البحر كالأعلام إن يشأ يسكن الريح فيظللن رواكد على ظهره إن في ذلك لآيات لكل صبار شكور. أو يوبقهن بما كسبوا ويعفو عن كثير. ويعلم الذين يجادلون في آياتنا ما لهم من محيص. فما أوتيتم من شيء فمتاع الحياة الدنيا وما عند الله خير وأبقى للذين آمنوا وعلى ربهم يتوكلون. والذين يجتنبون كبائر الإثم والفواحش وإذا ما غضبوا هم يغفرون. والذين استجابوا لربهم وأقاموا الصلاة وأمرهم شورى بينهم ومما رزقناهم ينفقون. والذين إذا أصابهم البغي هم ينتصرون. وجزاء سيئة سيئة مثلها فمن عفا وأصلح فأجره على الله إنه لا يحب الظالمين. ولمن انتصر بعد ظلمه فأولئك ما عليهم من سبيل إنما السبيل على الذين يظلمون الناس ويبغون في الأرض بغير الحق أولئك لهم عذاب أليم. ولمن صبر وغفر إن ذلك لمن عزم الأمور. صدق الله العظيم.
Thank you very much, Madinah, for starting off today's event. I'm just going to run through the timetable very quickly, and then I'm going to say a little bit about the Ibn Rushd lecture itself, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight. So Professor Alex Callinicos is going to give a 45-minute talk. After that, there'll be plenty of time for discussion and questions. And we also have people watching on the live stream tonight. And so I encourage, welcome to everybody who's on the live stream. And obviously, we welcome any questions and comments via the live stream. So I have an audience discussion. Then we'll have some closing remarks from Mufti Barkatullah, Chair of Trustees of the Muslim Institute, and also a short announcement about a new fund that the Muslim Institute has launched. And then around about 8 p.m, we'll all move into the lobby area where there'll be a hot and cold buffet as a reward for everyone who's come tonight. So let me just say a few words about the annual Ibn Rushd lecture that the Muslim Institute has instituted. The Ibn Rushd lecture celebrates the 12th century Muslim polymath, known to Latin West as Averroes. Ibn Rushd was a master of philosophy, theology, law and jurisprudence, astronomy, geography, mathematics, medicine, physics, and psychology. He's seen as a founding father of secular thought in Western Europe, and in the Muslim world, he's known largely for his defense of philosophy. Or if you can just put your phones on silent, that'd be great. It's okay. These lectures are intended to explore the contemporary relevance of Islam's intellectual history and free thinking everywhere. In the past, notable thinkers, including our guest tonight, and activists have delivered talks on Ibn Rushd himself, on finding the oldest Quran in the world, multiculturalism in the age of Brexit and Trump, Islamic philosophy today. Last year was on climate injustice by Asad Rahman, and today's subject is a Muslim world in a new age of catastrophe. So now, welcome. Now I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight. Alex Callinicos is Emeritus Professor of European Studies at King's College London. He also taught politics for many years at the University of York. He's a prolific author and public speaker. His most recent books include The New Mandarins of American Power, Imperialism and Global Political Economy, Deciphering Capital, Marxist Capital and Its Destiny, and his newly published work, The New Age of Catastrophe. He writes a weekly column for Socialist Worker. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Alex Callinicos to deliver a lecture for tonight.
Thanks very much, Hassan, for that kind introduction, and thanks for the beautiful prayer. I must say it's a good start. It's a terrific honor to be invited to give this lecture. I must make it clear to begin with that I'm a thoroughly secular Marxist thinker, but the current French government has a tendency to denounce the critics of its racist policies as Islamo-Marxists, and that label has been directed at me, and I'm quite happy to accept it, even if it's slightly fraudulent from a strictly religious point of view. I mean, I'm particularly appreciative to be giving the Ibn Rushd lecture, I'm currently working on the great Jewish philosopher Spinoza, and it's very interesting when you study his work written in the 17th century, the Christian 17th century, that he's engaging with medieval philosophers, some Jewish, very importantly, some Muslim, including particularly Ibn Rushd. And I think that the way in which philosophy in what Europeans at any rate call the Middle Ages is a model of cultural interchange. The way in which Muslim, Jewish and Christian philosophers drew on the same intellectual sources and influenced each other and debated with each other, that's how the exchange of ideas should take place, but very unfortunately doesn't very much. I'm not an expert on any kind of medieval philosophy, but I have studied one great Islamic thinker, Ibn Khaldun, and the great Tunisian philosopher and jurist, and his wonderful introduction to world history, which many people think in certain respects, in his stress on the material roots of civilization, anticipated Marx's later works. And one of the things that I've taken from both him and from Marx is the importance of taking a historical perspective on things. And in my new book that Hassan mentioned, The New Age of Catastrophe, I try to do that. When I talk about the new age of catastrophe, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that I think it's become clear, particularly since the pandemic, that we've entered an age which is comparable to what the historian Eric Hobsbawm called the age of catastrophe in the 20th century. In other words, the period between 1914 and 45, when we had the two world wars, the Great Depression, the Stalinist terror, the rise of fascism, and as a kind of climax of all this violence, the Nazi Holocaust, the attempt to exterminate the Jews of Europe. And I think that we're now in a comparable era, which, sorry, this isn't a very cheerful thing to say, but nevertheless, I think it's important, if one's going to address problems, to look them directly in the face. I think what's distinctive to the present age of catastrophe is the following. Whereas, if, just as is clear from my summary of the early 20th century, the driving force of catastrophe was war. The First World War, the way in which that precipitated the Great Depression, the extent to which fascism was a reaction to the First World War, and the Second World War is then an attempt to, if you like, to refight the First World War. So war is the driving force of the destruction and suffering that took place then. Now, of course, war is a present reality in the contemporary world. Not just everyone talks about Ukraine, but I'm going to talk a bit later about a couple of other wars, those in the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia and Sudan. So war is very much around and is a great threat with to everyone, with in particular the potential for nuclear confrontation between the United States and Russia over Ukraine. But I would say the driving force of catastrophe today is biological. It's the way in which, I would argue, the capitalist economic system is increasingly destroying nature. And the most obvious way in which that is true is, of course, when it comes to climate change. Modern industrial capitalism has always been fossil capitalism. In other words, it's been literally fueled by the consumption of fossil fuels. In the 19th century, coal; since the beginning of the 20th century, oil, and increasingly natural gas. Why has what Westerners call the Middle East been afflicted by such great interest from outside powers? It's not through admiration of the great civilizations that are to be found in the Middle East. It's, we all know, don't we? It's because of the oil. That's why the United States, supported by Britain, waged the chain of wars, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq, that have had such profoundly destructive effects and terrible long-term consequences far beyond even the borders of that region. But fossil capitalism and its dependence on fossil fuels is what is driving climate change. It's the CO2 emissions that arising from burning fossil fuels that are sending global temperatures rising fast, producing all sorts of disasters, floods, wildfires, droughts, all around the world. And increasingly, not just, although the global south is suffering particularly acutely from climate change, it's also affecting the rich part of the world as well. New York, the skies of New York were darkened for a day or so quite recently because of wildfires raging through Canada. The drought in Europe last year meant that the waters in parts of the Rhine sank so low that boats couldn't navigate them anymore. This has been a trade route, the Rhine, for thousands of years, but climate change stops it from operating properly. And similarly, the pandemic has to be really seen as part of this biological dimension to the crisis that we're confronting, because the roots of the pandemic lie in the capitalist industrialization of agriculture, which is now extending on a global scale, and which means, first of all, that human societies are invading the remaining wild spaces of the world, coming into contact with species that have been relatively isolated, but maybe harboring, unproblematically for them, but not for other species, pathogens. The pathogens then spread. Industrial agriculture clusters animals together in extremely insanitary conditions, and as a result of this process, you get pathogens jumping species, as in the case of SARS-CoV-2, jumping from bats to civet cats and reaching human beings. Scientists reckon this will happen increasingly because of climate change, because climate change pushes animals from their traditional habitats, brings them into contact with other species, pushes them closer to areas of human habitation, and this is the way more pathogens can be spread. So I would say the driving force of catastrophe, more than war today, is biological, in the ways that I've tried at least to allude to. The second dimension is economic. One economist, Michael Roberts, has written a book called The Long Depression, and what he describes in that book is the way in which the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009 produced a long period of slow growth in the capitalist economy, which more recently, the global capitalist economy, which more recently has been exacerbated by the pandemic, which caused the biggest slump, the most sharpest slump in the entire history of the world economy, and in the recovery period led to the kind of takeoff of inflation that we're currently experiencing. There's also a geopolitical dimension to this crisis. The US invaded Iraq in order to maintain its global hegemony. The Bush administration thought that if they entrenched their domination of the Middle East and their control over global oil supplies, they would advantage themselves relative to potential or actual competitors like China, Japan, Germany, and so on and so forth. That adventure, of course, went disastrously wrong from them. But in the context of the global financial crisis, what happened was that China increasingly increased its relative economic power, its hold on the world economy compared to the United States. So today, China is the center of global manufacturing production. It's the center of global trade. I think it's the biggest importer of energy. It hasn't displaced the United States as the dominant economy in the world, but it is beginning to challenge it in the way in which no previous rival did. And American policymakers now see China as a bigger threat to American hegemony than the Soviet Union ever was in the era of the Cold War. The result is growing competition between the US and China. Confronted with previous minor pandemics like the SARS pandemic in the 2000s, the US and China cooperated. When it came to a much bigger pandemic, one that is estimated to have killed nearly 24 million people, the US and China, rather than cooperating, intensified their conflict. People thought that this was just to do with Trump and his kind of crazy behavior, but we see, Joe Biden, who's a much more sort of stolid and apparently safe figure, continuing and in some ways exacerbating the confrontation with China. And other conflicts have to be seen in that context. The crisis destroyed the legitimacy of neoliberalism as an ideology for large sections of the population. The people who were hit most directly by the global financial crisis in Europe and also in other regions as well, the United States, other parts of the world, it's a global phenomenon, turned their backs on the mainstream parties, whether of the center-right or the center-left, that were the bearers of neoliberalism, and looked for alternatives. Unfortunately, at least from my point of view, they didn't look to alternatives, or they didn't find, if they looked at all, sufficiently credible alternatives from the left. This gave an opening to the far right, and we see this with, above all, with Trump's election. And let's remember, the liberal establishment in the, Trump is right that the liberal establishment in the United States are trying to destroy him with all these court cases. I think they're really stupid. Trump loves court cases. You know, this is a guy who's been in court all his life. He'll spin it out forever. The more he's prosecuted, the more angry his huge mass base gets, the stronger the support is for him. And of course, winning the presidency would be very convenient. If you're being pursued by the law, what better place to take refuge than the White House? But this isn't just, of course, a US phenomenon. If we look at the risings that are taking place in France at the present time, you know, one can admire and feel solidarity with those young people rebelling against the racist system that has murdered yet another young person. But one also has to note in fear that there's a polarization going on in which the far right are asserting themselves. You have the police unions issuing a statement which could be essentially have been written by Marine Le Pen, demanding emergency measures, harsh repression of the rioters. And you have, of course, Marine Le Pen herself and her fascist Rassemblement National trying to take advantage of the situation. The far right is everywhere. The Tory party has not completely capitulated to the far right, but you can see it's trying, so ramshackle and unpopular it is, it's trying to infuse itself with strength by drawing on far right themes, as we see with someone like Suella Braverman. Now, I think that the source of all these different dimensions of crisis is the capitalist economic system, a system that rests upon the exploitation of wage labor, and which is driven by what Marx called the competitive accumulation of capital. In other words, capitalism is a system that doesn't just exploit, but the exploiters themselves are internally divided. Marx called them a band of hostile brothers. They're brothers in the sense they're united in exploiting workers, but they're hostile in the sense they compete with each other. Each particular unit of the system, each firm or each state, trying to amass as much profits for itself of all the profits that they extract from the workers. And this means that capitalism is driven by a blind search for profit and the blind amassing of investments simply motivated by profit. Now this, I don't have time, I don't want to bore you with elaborating this economically, but this is crucial to understanding climate change, because it's really weird. You know, scientists for the last 40 years at least, it goes back to Thatcher. Thatcher actually acknowledged the problem of climate change. You have scientific report after scientific report saying that continuing consumption of fossil fuels generates CO2 emissions that force up global temperatures, and this will have catastrophic effects as time goes on. You know, everyone not everyone, but you know, there's a large consensus of what the problem is and the scale of the dangers. But what happens? Fossil fuels continue to be consumed, and the result is temperatures are rising. We're on the verge of breaking through the first of the barriers that scientists told us we mustn't break. That's the barrier of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. Why is that? Because this is a system that is dominated by competition for profits and also competition between rival states. And it's that is pushing us across the precipice. Now, how does this affect the Muslim world? Well, in lots and lots of ways, but I just want to give two examples. I want to mention first the Horn of Africa, well, which of course It's part of Northeast Africa where the population isn't entirely Muslim. Ethiopia has a majority Christian population, but nevertheless it's a region with a very strong Muslim presence, and it's a region that has been dominated by war for the last 40 plus years. If we look at Somalia, if we look at the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea that took place for quite a protracted time, if we look at the war going on within Ethiopia between Tigray and the central government at the present time, and now if we look at Sudan, where there's a war between essentially two rival armies of militarized predators, the Horn of Africa is one of the zones of the world to be affected first by the effects of climate change, particularly in the form of desertification, the spread of the desert that has been going on in recent decades. And desertification has the effect of increasing poverty. Very obvious reasons. These are societies that have learned how to live in their region over millennia, but now the basic, if you like, natural presuppositions of life are being disrupted by the expansion of the desert. So there's greater impoverishment. These are regions, dryland regions, studies by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that show this. Dryland regions like the Horn of Africa have greater concentrations of poverty. Anyway, the impoverishment in this context creates the conditions for people to try and survive through turning to force, through participating in one or other of the predatory armies that batten on these societies, because that's a way of surviving materially. And this then is reinforced by other effects of climate change, so that there's a study by Imperial College London that argues that the present drought in the Horn of Africa is a consequence of climate change. So that's there we see how climate change affects a particular part of the world with substantial Muslim populations for the worst. And of course, when this happens, you have people seek to escape. And that is something that takes people from the Horn of Africa westwards to take refuge westwards and northwards towards Europe to in the hope of finding a better life there. And now there's the horror involved in getting to Europe, crossing the Mediterranean, with the kind of mass murders that we see, for example, with the ship that went down off Greece a couple of weeks ago. Incidentally, depending on how much money you paid, you were closer to the deck, and the people at the bottom came from Pakistan, another, of course, Muslim society that is affected by some of the same processes, including desertification that I was talking about earlier. And on the whole, almost all the Pakistanis went down with the ship because they were too close to the lower levels of the ship to get out in time. It's an absolutely terrible. It's shameful. It makes me think of, the great response of Gandhi when he was asked what he thought of Western civilization, and he replied, "It would be a good idea." The other example I want to give is the rise of the far right, because if we look at how the far right function ideologically, central to their ideology is Islamophobia. In this sense, they're different from the classical fascist movements of the interwar period, above all the Nazis, the National Socialists. Central to Nazi ideology was anti-Semitism, and this was expressed in the most appalling way in the Holocaust. What you see with the contemporary far right is a combination of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim racism. As far as their, if you like, their public propaganda, the main emphasis is on hatred of Muslims, partly because, you know, Jews in pre-war Europe, there were many Jews who came as poor migrants to first Eastern and then Western Europe, very true of London, the kind of area where I live in Dalston in London, that was a heavily Jewish area. And they were the outsiders that the local British fascists could target. Now Muslims are the target. Of course, there's all sorts of ideological addition. There's the pathologization of Muslims is tied up with Western imperialist interventions in the Middle East. So Muslims are branded not just as outsiders, but as enemies. And this is, I mean, I'm talking about the far right, but of course you can find that also articulated in the mainstream. It's very interesting to see the way in which the Hindu right have penetrated the Tory party with people like Priti Patel and Braverman and so on and so forth. But also in France, pathologizing Muslims is mainstream. So in terms of building themselves as a popular force, hatred of Muslims is very important. Doesn't mean that they've abandoned anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism provides a kind of fake critique of capitalism. See, as a Marxist, I'm opposed to capitalism as a system. I don't care what the religion or race of the capitalists is. That's not important. They're exploiters. They're driving the world towards destruction. And for the far right, they understand that you have to attack the existing system, but they're not really against the system. In fact, they're hoping that, as in the 1920s and 30s, the establishment, sooner or later, will let them into the club and allow them to enter the government. Well, there's a fascist actually who's already Prime Minister of Italy, you know, and there, you know, if you look at what Giorgia Meloni is saying, she's presenting herself, just as Hitler did when he came to power, as a kind of safe, trustworthy protector of the capitalist system. But they still need anti-capitalist rhetoric to get support. So they use anti-Semitism to provide a source of that pseudo-anti-capitalism. The problem isn't capitalism, it's Jewish capitalism. It's international Jewish finance capital. Exactly what the Nazis said. That's why George Soros is attacked so much. In the old days, it was the Rockefellers or the Rothschild, sorry, actually the Rockefellers aren't Jewish. I meant the Rothschilds, who were the symbol of this sinister Jewish conspiracy, Jewish capitalist conspiracy. Now it's Soros. He's the kind of, anyone who talks about Soros and attacks him. I mean, of course, he's a very rich man, you know, he's a bad guy in all sorts of ways. But if you pick him out compared to the others, that's a sign that you're an anti-Semite. The most ridiculous, so there's this, you know, you have if you like, a multi-story racism that combines hatred of Muslims as a key popular mobilizing way, but also involves anti-Semitism as a source for a kind of pseudo-critique of capitalism, a phony critique of capitalism. But it doesn't, the funny thing, well, it's not funny, it's another, you know, really obscene thing, is that the same far right who are ideologically anti-Semitic support Israel, because they see Israel as a bastion of Western imperialism in the Middle East, and they want and pretend and assert that they can they want Western imperialism to survive and to become even stronger. So, and you can see this in the kind of alliances that Netanyahu has developed with various far-right figures in Europe, and indeed with Trump and the people around him. So Muslims are an object of attack by the far right, a crucial part of their ideological construction, and more than that, as we see in the alliance between Le Pen and the police now in France. So these are two examples of how the Muslim world, Muslim people are affected very directly in this new age of catastrophe. Okay, well, you know what? Sorry, I'm terribly sorry. None of this is very cheerful. How should one respond to this? With resignation? With despair? No. The kind of what I'm part of
10 minutes, Alex.
10 minutes, yeah, that's fine. With luck, it'll be less than that. It'll be lucky for you. One important point that I'm arguing in the book is that there's nothing natural about these catastrophes. Although natural mechanisms are at work in them, obviously with climate change, there's a physical mechanism at work. If you pump more CO2 into the atmosphere, temperatures rise, that's a physical mechanism. But at the start of the process are social causes lying in this process of capital accumulation that I've been talking about. The problems that we face, the threats that we face, the catastrophes that we are beginning to experience have social causes. They're contingent. There's nothing inevitable about what we're suffering. And therefore, the way out is to resist, to revolt, to pursue revolution. I mean, we've reached the point, I think, where the continued existence of the human species, and indeed quite a lot of other species, in the kind of conditions that humans have got used to in the past few centuries, is no longer consistent with the reproduction of capitalism. So if capitalism carries on, there will be more and more catastrophes. There will be more pandemics, more famines, more people being driven from their homes by so-called natural disasters or war. The only solution is to get rid of the capitalist system. Now we can discuss about what the alternative is. I would advocate a socialist planned economy, and not just because I'm a socialist and into planning, but because we need planning. You can't, if we're to have a carbon neutral economy, if we're going to cut carbon out of the economy, we're going to need a great deal of planning. The choice is, who does the planning? Who controls the process of planning? At the minute, we're having more and more planning from above in highly undemocratic forms to preserve the existing system. Or we can have democratic planning from below, in which people collaborate to coordinate production and consumption and to move the way in which we organize the economy to move it decisively towards carbon neutrality. Those are the choices. As I say, I see the only solution as being a revolution that can create that kind of society. What do I mean by revolution? I think the best way of understanding revolution is provided by a great Marxist thinker, Walter Benjamin, who was one of the victims of the Nazis during the Second World War. He killed himself trying to get away from them when he feared he couldn't escape them. And he said, at a terrible moment, I mean, a worse moment than now, when the Nazi armies were moving westwards, having broken the French armies, he said that Marx saw revolution as the locomotive of history, you know, sort of taking us forward on the continued march of progress. And Benjamin said, well, maybe we should think about revolution in a different way. Maybe we should think of it as the passengers on the train, this locomotive, reaching for the emergency cord. And that's how I see revolution, as stopping a system that is out of control from destroying us. Okay, I mean, I think that's essentially my, if you like, my diagnosis. Not that I'm, I was going to say not that I'm a doctor, but actually I am a doctor, but only of philosophy, so it doesn't count. How much this is incompatible with Muslim thought is an interesting matter for discussion. I'm, as I brought out, far from remotely expert in Muslim philosophy, but I do know that one central value is that of justice. And revolution isn't just about saving us from catastrophe, it's about achieving justice. And it's clear that we live in a world from which justice is absent. And like they're saying in French, in the streets of France at the minute, no justice, no peace. Thank you very much.